Hey, how's it going?
I'm not bad, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good. Um, Another week, another episode. Last week we spoke about grads and real life benefits and what is an actual benefit. Um, and hopefully people found that super helpful when they're flicking through job descriptions. And I suppose over the last few episodes, we've taken people through, getting their foot in the door, surviving in the startup world, and obviously benefits. So today, I think we're going to look at when things get a little bit bumpy and might not work out the way that we always hope things do. Should be interesting.
Yep, let's do it. So, where do you want to kind of start? I mean, look, it's one of those spaces. I suppose the startup world is something that you have to have been in it or be in it to understand it. I mean, we even have our own lingo that people outside of the startup world don't understand. But yeah, I think there's something to be said about when you're new into the workplace, when you're new into the world of I have to make decisions for myself and how you can kind of navigate if and when failure is approaching. How do you even make that decision? I remember having to, the first time I ever had to think about whether or not I want to quit a job. I just remember that being such a trying time for me because I thought to myself, okay, this is really me adulting, right? Um, and I don't know about you, but I remember my perspective of the workplace and things like redundancies was almost like such a foreign topic. I thought that
Mm,
redundancy is something that only happened in the way in the past, when if you think about when the internet first was created and you had that transitional time from traditional jobs where it was most people's jobs were mainly manual labor, and then you had a little bit of a transition into what we now know as the modern world of working. My understanding of redundancies, and I think even the case studies we used to look at when I did business studies, it was always okay, going from a factory worker, they shut down the factories, okay, where do these skilled workers go? So being in
mm.
this startup world and the tech world, and people would start talking about redundancies, it was a little bit of a new and foreign concept. How does it apply to this modern world? And it doesn't necessarily mean that an industry within itself has collapsed. It's just that particular company. And yeah, it can be quite scary and frightening, and it can lots of leave you with lots of feelings of uncertainty and
Mm.
not really knowing what to do, especially because for me anyway, I remember associating redundancy with being a little bit older in age. But we both had know that people in their early 20s were being made redundant left, right, and centre. And it wasn't a reflection on them as an individual and their performance. It was actually just, this was just part and parcel of being in
Mm.
such a fast paced environment. So I don't know, what comes to mind in terms of the boom and the failure
It's
of
yeah, it's a really
companies?
interesting thing because I think I am a little bit older than you. We'll leave ages at the door. But I graduated into a world of redundancy. Like when I was
Mm,
when I was at university and when I graduated, I saw the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and I think that was probably the first time I'd actually understood or been made aware of what a redundancy is, because this is what 2008. This is financial services, arguably probably one of the safest industries, sectors, markets to work in globally, and you've just seen like thousands of people walking out. The very prolific images of people walking out of Lehman Brothers with boxes and,
Yeah.
oh, I don't have a job, my life's over. So like that's probably sort of my earliest non-working memory. Um, but I don't really think. I think it was probably. I mean, we're talking 10 years ago anyway. Um, Redundancies started to happen when, for me, in my experience, was when the sort of the great outsource started to begin, when people were moving things abroad, right?
Mm.
Because it was cheaper. Let's not beat around the bushes. No real other reason other than price. It was cheaper, and that was kind of my first actual involvement in that process. I wasn't at risk or on the sort of the risk radar, but witnessing like teams of people being let go and going through that process of, and this, I think, interestingly, isn't actually about things not working, because in that period of my life, those people were let go because of company success, but the success then moved the company into, I guess, a different path, in that they could service those functions of the business elsewhere for cheaper, and arguably get the same level of quality, which a conversation for another day, but I don't agree with. So yeah, I think you kind of, so it is weird in this sense that you see sort of things, people going when things don't work out, but actually there's also this big, things do, people go when things do work out, because I mean, arguably you could look at the rise of AI at the moment for in the tech sector specifically. I'm not going to talk about. I mean, it has a huge impact elsewhere across other markets and the public sector and the private sector. But if you look at sort of the tech space, and I mean, we've spoken about this on previous episodes of sort of the rise of AI and the reduction of entry level jobs, but also people who have been in a role for a few years, or are not quite entry level but not mid management or senior level. The the sort of the complex and unknown trajectory of AI, I think, is, and these are not redundancies because companies are doing bad.
Mm.
These are companies that are cashing in on, ultimately, uh, probably just a profit
Yeah.
drive.
A profitable
I
a
think,
profitable trend.
yeah, and I think it is, and this kind of highlights this sort of wave of bubbles, right? This, we had the dot-com boom, we've had what I can only describe as like marketplace madness in like the late tens, early
Yes.
20s, of um, there was money to be made in reinventing services that already existed. I think is probably the best way of describing a marketplace business. And now you've got AI, which, I'm not an economist, but the smart people in those jobs think it's a bubble. So we're kind of, and these, they've happened before, they'll happen again, they'll bust and, realign and readjust. But I think ultimately, like, when you're talking about, as someone who is moving into a job, and you're unsure of the future, I think
Mm.
there's a bit of sort of proofing yourself against, things will change, redundancies happen, but not only just because they're bad, but also because of other like because things are going wrong. Sorry. Redundancies happen when things are going right. Mergers, for example, another prime example when people tend to be made redundant. The duplication of work doesn't necessarily mean that companies are sinking, but it does indicate that there are other motivations um, for the business. So I think it is. I know we've started off quite deep in the redundancy world, which is sort of the last port of call, I think, for most companies, and I know it is from my experience. But it's never easy dealing with the prospect of being let go.
Potentially, yeah. And I think there's okay, so the prospect of being let go, right? Um, for some people who haven't necessarily been in a company when it's going through a difficult time, that difficult time could to them translate as, oh my gosh, am I going to lose my job? Oh my gosh, is this company going to fail? So perhaps then, what do you think about some of these? So look, there are some business models, right, that their whole purpose is to create something with the intention of selling it within a very short space of time. And I think the general listener is likely to understand the idea of physical products. You go and buy in bulk,
Mm.
you perhaps do some small alterations, and you sell it for a profit. The exact same can happen within the tech world. So you mentioned about when there are mergers, sometimes there are also so there are mergers and there are also acquisitions, right? So why they typically fail or sometimes are acquired in such a short space of time is because of that model of let's create something with the intention of selling it. We get in and we get out, right? And that is most of the time the people who have founded that company have sometimes they've well most of the time they've come up with that idea knowing from the very beginning that their intention is to sell it. They're not trying to scale a business to then be a CEO of a large corporation. They're more so sometimes you find people are serial startup entrepreneurs. They create things, they sell them. Sometimes they get hired to go and run startup companies that are owned by these big corporations because of their experience of having done the same elsewhere. And I
Mm.
wonder for someone who is let's say a first jobber or second jobber, they're an employee in one of these companies, and it does seem like the company's moving in a direction that's different from when they joined. Yeah, what do they do? I mean, what are some of the things that come to mind to you? There's the idea of ride it until the wheels fall off, or some people start running away.
I think I think it's a great question. There's a couple of things that kind of spring to mind. Is like companies do change direction, right? Colloquially known as a pivot,
Yeah.
um,
Yes.
right? If you've worked at a startup and no one's mentioned the word pivot, uh, you're not at a startup.
You're not.
Pivot is probably like the one word that's bantered around because people pivot all the time. You've got to pivot. We're pivoting, right? Famous Friends scene with Ross carrying the sofa, shouting pivot. Right? I think that was synonymous with like tech in probably 2016 onwards. Pivoting is fine, by the way, because it's usually the company have realized what they think is the right fit might not be the right fit, and therefore they do have to make some changes. So it's not scary always. So I think if you are at a pivoting business, which you should be in the tech world, in my opinion, um, it's whether that pivot still aligns with what you signed up for. So, like, if you are, I don't know, I can't even really think of a good example. When you join a business or you join a startup, you're usually given a real strong mission or identity or story or something jazzy that is like, we're changing the world, right? It's glamorous. It's usually pretty sexy, and you're like, oh my god, this is great. Whether that pivot or pivots, sometimes a series of pivots, still aligns with you, then I would say give it a whirl and see what happens, because who knows, who knows. If someone is then, if you're working at, like, I don't know, ecotech, and your CEO then turns around and we're pivoting and we're going into fossil fuels, you're probably not going to be on the same mission, and therefore, yeah, you might want to think about getting out, right? That's probably a real simple, quite rudimentary example. But also, I think it's more around your appetite for risk. If you're pivoting into something that is unknown, or into a sort of an unsafe space that might jeopardize roles or your earning potential, that is also another reason in which you might want to consider looking elsewhere. I think my first example of whether the mission still aligns with what you're doing is an extremely privileged thing to think about, because not everyone has the ability to jump jobs because of social or moral factors of what of companies are doing. A lot of people, work because they need a paycheck. Yeah, I think in my experiences, I've always been sort of like a ride it until the wheels do fall off. Can I say that that's a good? You learn a lot. Whether it's like the best environment to learn, not always. It's obviously quite stressful. The good things generally have dried up. You're working quite hard for something that you might not necessarily align with. If you're still working there, and the company is sort of on a downward curve, that bumpy road isn't for everyone. And actually, it becomes really difficult, because you're trying to give your all to something that you kind of believe in. Then going and looking for other jobs is also really hard, because you feel like you're put into this. You're sort of torn between being involved in what you're doing, but then also a bit of self-preservation. And I think what we've touched upon earlier in this series is self-preservation is the most important thing for any individual. You've got to look after yourself. You've got to make sure that you've got the money that you need to maintain your lifestyle, to exist, to pay for all of the boring things in life. So yeah, I think it does kind of come down to a bit of an appetite for risk, really. You will build fond memories of seeing something through until the end, be it successful or unsuccessful. But memories don't pay bills. So my sort of general, I think it comes down to sort of personal circumstance, really. What do you think?
Yeah, there's something you said that really it reminded me of some of the times that I've experienced in the past. And that idea of whether or not the company continues to align with your initial objective, I think, is a good thing for people to think about, right? And we spoke in the last episode about the two potential cohorts that we're speaking to. We've got one who is not necessarily relying on the startup job to fund their entire lifestyle. Perhaps they've got additional support. And then the second being someone for whom the startup is their sole and main income and support for their lifestyle, right? So if we think of those two cohorts, I'd say that for both of those, it is still something that, if you remember when I'd mentioned in one of the previous episodes about when you're interviewing and the fact that you do end up speaking to the founder, especially if it's a much smaller company than the large corporates that are out there, you do get an idea of their vision, what their mission is. Another common thing that gets spoken about in startups is your mission, vision, and values. There's always lots of sections spent on trying to draft that and make sure that it actually aligns with whatever product or services that that startup provides. I would say that you should also have individual mission, vision, and values. And sometimes that pivot, like you said, you may still be able to find something that aligns with what your goals are. And then also remember, there are a lot of people in startups that even they don't know what they want to do. So just don't. I would say not to just jump ship so quickly. I always think that in these circumstances, and this is me reflecting, right? Because I'm not going to sit here and act like I haven't had reactive moments or emotive moments while I've been in, these uncertain or shaky environments. Um, but so yeah, so on reflection, I do think that it's best to try and be rational and balanced in your decision making as opposed to reactive and emotive. Just because, like you said, sometimes those changes are happening not because things are not going right, but actually because they are going well for the company. So it's about you as an individual thinking about how you can find value in this new direction and also how you may be able to show your own value with this new direction. I'd also say the thing about a startup that in these small companies, and when I'm talking about the small company, I'm talking those times where you knew your employee number. Do you remember when you'd always be, oh yeah, I'm number 5 or I'm number 11? In those environments, everyone is so close that you would look. We've met obviously we've made friends in these environments, right? The people that you work with in many ways can be like your friends in the sense that, okay, I know when you're hiding something. I know when you're saying everything's fine, but you're not actually fine. You can pick up on some of those things when you're all sat in a very small space and you're spending so much time together. And sometimes it may well be that, similar to the time when you say to yourself, I think it's time for this friendship to end, you may also have that same feeling when you're in that startup. So I'm not saying by any means that you should just always stay when things seem uncertain. But I think if there gets a point where instinctually you feel like something is not quite right and you feel that you're no longer able to perform, that's to me when it's probably the time for you to start looking. And think about the conversations. I remember one of the things that I think is really good about that startup environment is the stand ups, for example, because you get to know what everyone else is working on, people get to know what you're working on. You can share blockers, you can share big wins, and you are more directly connected or closely connected to that company's output, something you don't necessarily get in a corporate. Now, why that can work in your benefit in scenarios like this, where it seems like failure is approaching or it seems like the company's moving in a direction that's different to how it was when you first joined, is you usually would, if you reflect properly, you can get signals of things during those times. And if things such as the communication starts to reduce, that's probably also a good indicator of, okay, maybe I don't necessarily want to write this, because if they're not being as communicative as they used to be, then it could be that there's something to worry about. But I do also want to say that sometimes there are instances where there are things like NDA. So if they're being purchased by someone potentially, they just can't talk about it. So it's not always that they are being super secretive because of something negative. There are so many reasons which, I mean, we'd have to write a whole dissertation to go into the many different scenarios you could find yourself in. But yeah, I think rely on your instinct and look out for some of those signals. Remember that these are people that you're around for more time than you are the people in your personal life. So that definitely is something that you want to take into consideration. I mean, I don't think we've not touched on burnout in any of these episodes, right? I mean, that's something that is sadly quite common in the startup environment. I've experienced it. I know lots of people who have experienced it, and it's not the nicest of feelings. And so, if you have the potential to be burnt out, and I'm not saying that that's exclusive to the startup environment at all, I know that it can happen in all different
Yeah.
workplaces. But because there is that potential, you want to always consider, is this actually worth it? And if it is approaching that time where it no longer feels worth it, then to me, that's your cue to say, let me figure out something else.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important mention, actually, burnout. And I think when we're talking about like when things don't work out at a business level, yeah, companies don't work out, whatever, 9 out of 10 don't succeed. Um, but actually, sometimes you just don't. Being at a business, being in an environment, just isn't the right place for you, right? Like you can go, you can have the best interview process and the best hiring process and onboarding process, and you can have a great start, but then you know that something is missing. You've got that feeling it's just not quite right. It's like whatever it is, it's communication, it's the leadership, it's the day to day. Let's be honest, like sometimes you get in, you're oversold on the day to day. You get some kind of wacky job title and all of the promises under the sun and a benefits list that's 30 pages long, but then you kind of realize that you're not doing any of that. You're just doing one thing or a couple of things. That there's this whole sort of like, I guess, sort of like misselling of the environment, the role, and the space. Therefore, you kind of are like, actually, this isn't for me. And again, it's this kind of, you don't you feel guilty to a degree. I've just started. I can't move. On my CV, it's going to have a gap. I've got to see it out for a year. And it's yes and no. This is also isn't. As long as you've got a good, honest story, I think you can sell that elsewhere. Like I wouldn't think that it's not. I would probably describe it as a beige flag more than a red flag these days. Um, but also, so you again, what I said earlier about self-preservation, you've got to think about yourself, and like you just said, you spend too much time at work to not enjoy, or for the environment to like stress you out, burn you out. Um, so things can not work out from a completely different angle, in that like
Mm.
the environment isn't for you, the team isn't for you, and therefore you kind of do have to start looking. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a much harder conversation to have because you're having it with yourself. Um, but the very moment that you begin to resent what you're doing, is the number one sign for me that it's time to go. If you resent turning up to somewhere, if you resent logging in, if you resent speaking to people in your job, you resent doing any of it, basically, I'd take a big, long, hard think about whether it's the right place for you. Um, and for your own peace of mind, my advice from experience would be to go and do something else. Um, I think it's work takes up too much of your time for it to cause that many problems. And again, the caveat here is this comes from a place of immense privilege, in that if you can take that time to realize, and obviously have the choice in that you want to go elsewhere, because ultimately those starting out, if you're listening to this, you're pondering like an entry role, or you're in an entry role and you're looking for sort of like the next step, it is incredibly tough out there at the moment. So that kind of balance of self-preservation, but also instinct of whether there is something out there. I would never advise anyone to leave before they know they have something lined up, because you enter a whole world of other stress.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think, yeah, there are things for people to think about. Like, it's okay if things don't work out. Um, Learn from it. Every experience is a learning opportunity. It's not a waste of your time. But yeah, don't don't be loyal for the sake of, you've got like a really nice friend who works there. You've got to look after yourself.
Yeah, and something you actually just said really it brought me back again because the thing of your CV and potentially having gaps, right? There's this something that I think most people are aware of, but just in case they're not, many of these startups know each other. So not just employees moving around. So you've come from, especially the linear ones, right? So if you've moved from one marketplace startup that serves a particular industry to another that also serves that same industry, people either have worked with each other or there are people who are friends. Sometimes it's in the leadership that they know each other. So you'd be surprised at how unsurprised a hiring manager is to speak to you knowing where you've come from because they may know things about your work environment that you don't even know. So sometimes that might be on the back of your mind that, oh my gosh, if I've only been here for 6 months and I'm already now thinking about leaving. And when you go and speak to that other company, as soon as the reason why they've even brought you into an interview is they already know that, okay, one, they know about a similar environment, right? So whether it's the product, whether it's the type of customers, you come in with sometimes an advantage over another candidate who has no experience in that same world. So have that in mind. The other thing is there is sometimes whispers can start, whether it's potentially people are talking because they're out in meetings looking for funding, whether it is that let's say someone in leadership has confided in someone who they think is a friend, and now there's something about that particular company that perhaps you don't want in the view of a competitor or direct competitor. That happens a lot. So I think when thinking about interviewing for new roles and like how you're going to potentially discuss your current company, so as Rich said, please, the ideal is to do that while you're still employed. It's worth keeping in mind that people are more aware of sometimes the fragility that can exist in these environments than you may
Yeah.
have considered. So people are actually a lot less judgmental than you may imagine. I've been on interview panels where someone has been somewhere for 3 months and they talk about that particular company and then we kind of understand why it is that they've left. So the role sometimes has a little bit of an influence in how you judge the person's CV and then the environment that they've come from. But I will say something to think about is how you talk about the previous company and the people you worked with. You don't want to go into a new place and the first thing that you're doing is slagging off the people you used to work for and work with. That's definitely not a good approach. But yeah, just consider that they probably are more understanding than if you went from a 10
Yeah.
people startup to a 11,000 people big corporation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice. I think like that whole like not burning bridges is super important. Like even when you're looking for a new role and you've got a job and you're like, you might just be, you know, whatever the right saying is, scanning the market or whatever the right one is. Um, those people are going to be that manager that you might not like or love is going to be the one providing a reference at some point. And like you said, the world is small. People will be in like, networking groups or they'll just know each other, like loose lips over a pint or two. Like you kind of, it's it's just one of those things. It's an occupational hazard. It happens in tech, in every industry.
Mm.
But yeah, I think if for when the time comes, um, just remember that you still do need something. There's always a last ask from the company that you're leaving, and that last ask is sometimes a case of like your new place will want to speak to your previous company or confirm things. they might want a reference from your last 2 roles, for example. So yeah, you've got to maintain a decent relationship, right? Of, please, can I have a reference? Indicatively, if I get a reference for someone that is just the bare minimum, it kind of speaks volumes. But I get that it's not, some people just need out and they'll take the risk, and that's fine. That's life. But yeah, it is. It's tough. It's tough out there. Keeping. It's really hard maintaining relationships that you're not actually that interested in maintaining. Like, you kind of half your foot is out the door, and you're kind of like, I don't really want to be here, like feeling quite resentful, or like quite a lot of resentment, and you're just kind of like, I don't then want to have to be nice, but you kind of have to just keep a level of civility, because you might need them, and also you might cross paths again. Like if you're working in the same space, or you're in the same, tech is such a broad church, you're not never going to see anyone again. Like you will come across people in different roles, or people will move on. So there is this sort of level of self-interest for your future
Absolutely.
self.
Yeah. I was just having this conversation with a former colleague of mine, and at the time we worked together, there was a really difficult personality that was, that person that everybody knows is a difficult personality, but for some reason they somehow stay around, and most people don't actually understand why, but they're there, right? And we we actually by accident met someone who used to work with this particular person, and they had stories upon stories about how they were when they had worked together, and this person had worked with them 15 years ago. So that's just a real life example of, in these spaces, people do you can end up interacting with a future colleague of someone's, a
Yeah.
former colleague of someone. So just kind of keep that in mind when you are moving on. That yeah, you could potentially cross paths again. Something that you mentioned. What do you think about when you're searching for a new company? So let's say like someone's in that scenario where they're saying, "All right, this is it for me. I want to move on." Do you think it's a good idea to move to a company that's similar or providing a similar service? I know, of course, the caveat of sometimes you will have non-competes in your contract, so that's something to check and also confirm with your existing company, ideally at the time, who they consider their competitors to be, because sometimes that line can be murky. But with that caveat in mind, would you suggest to a person to move somewhere that is similar in terms of the customer base, or do you think in the presence of choice they should go somewhere that's completely different?
I think it's to the individual. Like I moved marketplace to marketplace, but then after that I moved into health, then finance. So like not really much of a linear path there. The industries were different, but the roles were the same. So I think it kind of depends on what you can apply to elsewhere. And also depends of your appetite. Like if you're leaving somewhere because like it didn't quite work out for you, or like you weren't enamored with the environment and the people, moving to a company that does a similar thing in the same space probably going to be filled with the same type of people. So your move might not be actually that far away from what you already have. Sorry, bad grammar. What you've already got, have, whatever the right saying is. And therefore you're just sort of starting the cycle again, but somewhere new, probably a better offer and hopefully a better sort of comp package. So it really does depend. I think there are pros to it. Obviously, you bring a level of experience or industry knowledge, um, but you might work completely differently. You know, to the way that they might do something completely different. So I think it is it's an odd one. There's definitely a convenience factor about it because you're kind of already knowing what's going on. Um, but also sometimes like new applying your skill set to something new is fun,
Yeah.
right? It's it's enjoyable. The learning curve is steep. You're you're able to bring a wealth of experience or knowledge about the thing that you do, but you might then have to learn about a particular industry. Like when I moved into sort of the health tech space, I knew nothing about health really. Um, so you kind of get this, but then I loved it. Right, I moved into a space like I brought operational knowledge, um, working with external stakeholders and all of the sort of building systems that all came with me and I applied that, but then at the same time I got to learn about uh, DNA sequencing and health markers and all kinds of other stuff, which was fun, and I got to meet a whole new um, sort of cohort of people. I was suddenly surrounded by doctors and scientists and like actual like real clever people that could tell you about really intricate details of the human body, and it was a marvel. Like it was great. It was good fun, but ultimately I was able to bring my bread and butter of the stuff that I knew. Um, so I found that like that was refreshing. Um, but again, it's whether that's the world that you want, or if you just want a pay bump and slightly better benefits. I think it really does depend. Personally, I'd always sort of push for the new thing. I'd like to, I'd want to do something new. Um, but it's not for everyone. What do you think? What would be your method?
I would be more focused on my role. So, where is it that I want to grow, for example, or what are new experiences that I'd like to have,
Mm,
and then focus my search on that. So, I'm not as fixated in the particular industry as such. That being said, the majority, if not, I think all of my career has been in some type of software. So that ended up being my niche. So when I go and speak to a new software company, whether or not they're serving, for example, healthcare customers, which I've experienced,
mm,
whether they're serving, what else have I done? The gig economy, whether it's
yeah.
insurance, whether it is, I mean, I've worked with so many different tech companies, so many different customer bases, e-commerce. So for me, it needs to be in software. That is just something that I prefer, just because I understand the inner workings of a software company, and I would just prefer to expand my horizons and from that aspect of things. So I think it does. I think both of those are good options for a person. Is okay. Do you want to just try something new, or do you want to specialize in something and just expand your experience in that particular specialism? So it really just depends on that. And I think as well, there's nothing wrong with not necessarily knowing what you want to do. So if you are
Mm,
still unsure and you're in that company who is, for whatever reason, there's some type of failure. So whether it is failure in your ability to perform in the way you want to perform, failure in the way that it's serving you, whatever failure means to you at that particular time, if you are going to be moving on, but then you don't know exactly still what you want to do, then there's also option to just pivot in your role. People do that. I mean, I've definitely been hired, and I've hired people that have come from one particular discipline and going into another. Startups again are great for that. They're most of the time they care about who you are, what you could do, as opposed to what you have done. And I was given a piece of advice by a mentor many years ago when I was taking a leap from one company to another. And she said to me, they've hired you for 80% is because of you. So your existing skills, your experiences, how you've applied those. And that 20%, which is understanding that company, it will come once you're in the door. Because that was my initial, I suppose, not a reservation because I'd already agreed and signed the contract, but the biggest things that the largest source of my anxiety was that I didn't understand this particular software company's customer base. And I thought that I'd spent so many years understanding one particular customer type. And in my area, which is security and privacy, it is quite important to understand who it is that the company is servicing, because then you can provide adequate advice for how those particular customers would be expecting, for example, their data to be secured and their privacy to be maintained and followed. And then also what comes with that are sometimes jurisdictional requirements. So you might have regulatory requirements. And because of that, I was really worried because to me, that was the majority of the role. But how she'd explained it to me being actually 20% of the role, it helped me feel really confident. And I've started to apply that from then I applied it into my life that, it's not something that you should allow to be a hindrance in your growth. There are so many opportunities outside of where you are. And I know sometimes it can feel like school. I remember times in school when it felt like that was the entire world. Sometimes in a company, you can feel like that is the entire world, but my God, the world outside is big. And don't allow your current circumstances to make you feel like there's nothing else that is possible. And yeah, I think when you can and if you can, try and maintain those relationships with the people you used to work with. Don't force it. Anything that is natural, then let it be natural. So if you have made friends, you can keep those friends. There's nothing to say that, oh, we can no longer speak to each other. Former colleagues that have always been like colleagues, they could still in some ways be of benefit to you. They could be mentors. I've got mentors that are people I used to work with, people that I used to report to. That is something that in that environment of potential failure, that can be a really good takeaway because they also move on sometimes and they've also had experiences before they worked with you, and you just never know what scenario you could find yourself in that they could provide some really good insight. So yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
what I would do.
I think the maintaining relationships is an undervalued um, element. Like you say, like don't. It's not about forcing it, but you never know when a contact is just going to be handy, right? It could be the one time. I mean, even like when we were doing tech inclusion in COVID, like I spoke to people that I never thought I'd speak to again because they worked in a world that I had decided 4 years earlier that I would never ever
Go back
enter
to yeah.
ever again. And that kind of mental block of like, I didn't leave on bad terms. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I left the city, I started at Deliveroo and then I went back for my leaving drinks so that I could have a bigger turnout. I mean, how narcissistic is that? Um, but but after that leaving drinks, I never thought I'd really see or speak to anyone, like especially like people that I reported into. And then there I was, middle of a lockdown, scraping through LinkedIn and like WhatsApp and like, oh, hi, can I have 5 minutes of your time? So like it does kind of come back in the most surprising ways. And you just never know. You might just be at something and you will bump into someone.
Yeah.
And what you don't want is the last the last memory for them being a really bad one. Or for you. I mean, it's probably going to be worse for you if you're leaving the place that that you worked at. But yeah, I think it's a really undervalued skill. Not skill, asset. I think undervalued asset. Um, in that, what's the saying? Is like your real net worth is your network or something. Like having a well-rounded network of people. And I'm not. This isn't people that you want to have to go that you want to go for brunch with, or you're going to hang out with at the weekend. These are like people that you can confidently walk up to and say hello to, and they will remember who you are. Um, they are a bit of a secret weapon, um, and especially if you are moving and looking for new jobs, because the world is not static. People don't always remain at the same companies, so those people that you may have thought you won't see again also move and may end up at the same places. So I think that's a um, really good thing to maintain. Yeah, it's a weird old um, a weird old thing having to find. I mean, I think the most important thing for me for people to take away is that like finding a job is a job in itself. Like if you're moving or thinking about moving, my goodness, it can become a full-time job, because you are often doing it outside of the 9 to 5 or the job, and you're then having to essentially do another job when you get home,
Mm.
or like on the tube home. And like yeah, there are loads of tools that make it easier. You've got Jack and Jill, um, LinkedIn. I think ChatGPT are even launching a dedicated jobs function to take on LinkedIn's dominance in the job market sort of space. Um, yeah, I think my sort of my big takeaways for people, if you are moving around or you're looking for something, the next challenge, I think, is what always people always say. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just looking for the next challenge. Um, yeah, maintain good relationships. Think about what you need. Um, think about what you want, um, and see what's out there.
Yeah.
That most of my jobs I have come across through dumbfound luck, or like sounds interesting and I've just gone with it. Bit of a gut instinct. I'm not quite sure that's wise advice for a lot of people. Um, what would you say you've learnt through navigating, starting, and moving around?
Reputation is going to be your biggest currency. Um, it's why I stress a lot about how you talk about the people that you work with, how you talk about the people you've worked with.
Mm,
It's really important that you think about. I know I've probably said this in other episodes, in some way, shape, or form, but you have to constantly be thinking about your CV at the end of the day. So if you have things that you can talk about, shout about, that's always really helpful. And if there are people that can co-sign the things that you're talking about, then it just puts you in a much stronger position. And yeah, like you said, your network can eventually be quite useful, not even just for jobs, but sometimes as sounding boards. It's good to talk to people who speak the same language as you. And when you've worked with someone, even outside of it being having been a startup, but just general work experience, having worked with someone before, there are things that the two of you or the group of you can talk about that other people just won't understand because they weren't there at the time that you were there, you know? So, yeah, I'd say have a think about what is important to you. Kind of look at it like some of the things we spoke about when we were talking about how to get into the market. Again, when you're trying to leave and enter somewhere else, those same principles can be quite handy. So that's what I'd say is, yeah, have a think about what's important to you and start putting the feelers out. Don't be ashamed to put the feelers out. Let people know that you trust, that you are thinking about what else could be out there, and you'll be surprised what could come along.
Yeah, I think that's really, really sound advice. It can also take longer than you expect it to, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because good things come to those who wait. So I think it is kind of, if it seems too good to be true, I hate to say it, but it probably is. I think that's really sound advice. It's been really, really great talking. I think a little bit more about the unsexy side or the reality of working in this space. I think often we are sold how wonderful it is because there's beer taps and ping pong tables. But I think if you're starting out in life, sorry, you're not starting out in life. If you're starting out in your professional life, in your work life, if you're listening to this and you are starting out in life, not the right show. Yeah, if you are starting out in your professional life, I think it is really, really important to remind yourself that not everything is as glamorous as it's made out to be. And that whilst shows like Silicon Valley and all of the other sort of the one about WeWork, they highlight some really great parallels. They are not the truth; they are fiction, and they might not highlight some of the sort of the ugly reality. I think of working in such a wonderful and dynamic space. I would always encourage people to do it. I think it's still one of the best environments that you can learn and thrive in. But it comes with risk. And I hope that people out there find this useful. It's a bit of an honest insight into the ugly side of startup life.
Yeah, and there you go. There's the startup graduate.
All right, awesome. Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.